let's talk about my weakest reading month this year. Hello fellow readers and readeresses. Before I say anything else, please excuse my hair. I planned on having it done and looking civilized for this video. However, my hairdresser had the audacity to give birth in August to the cutest little baby boy, and apparently spending time with him is more important than my roots. Honestly, some people are so selfish. You know, I was convinced that August was gonna be the month where I finally finished my TBR, considering how few books were actually on it and how excited I thought I was about the majority of them. And yet, ironically, it turned out to be my worst reading month of the year. Well, my worst reading month of the year so far. This was mostly because I started a new job, and as you can imagine, I was putting my best efforts into getting acquainted with it. And to be honest with you and with myself, for a while there, I think I was in a bit of a reading slump. Regardless, at the end of the day, I read some good books, and I guess that's what matters the most. But before we talk about the books that I read, let's quickly go through the TBR for August so that you can see what I was working with. We had Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb, which was a series-style landing. You Like It Darker by Stephen King, which was a prompt card to read a standalone book. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which was a prompt card to read a hardback book with a black cover. The Fall of Gondolin by J.R.R. Tolkien, which was a prompt card to read a book with a castle/fortress on the cover or in the title. The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. This was a prompt card to read a book from a long series, at least 10 books, and it was also my buddy read with Gabby from Gabby Likes to Read. Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, which was a free choice for completing the map. And Empire of the Damned by J. Kristoff, which was a leftover from July. As always, let's start with the casualties. I wasn't able to get to 2 whole books this month, and those were The Fall of Gondolin and Assassin's Quest. Frankly, I had absolutely no energy for either of those books, but I really want to read them, so I'll try to sneak them in one of the following TBRs. Now, let's go through the books that I finished in the order in which I finished them. The first book I finished was actually my favorite book of the month, and that is Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. This is a standalone adult sci-fi that was published in the early 80s. Honestly, I can't believe this book is not more popular. It's such a spectacularly original and intriguing take on the first contact with aliens trope. It's so well written, so mysterious, so intellectually stimulating, and so emotionally wrecking. If you have any interest in sci-fi whatsoever, I implore you to read this book. You need to read it. It is short and it is spectacular. Now, the ending is left rather open, but I think it suits the story perfectly, and honestly, I don't think it could have been done any better. Really, just read the book, okay? I gave it 5 stars. Next, which was probably 2 weeks later, I finished Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is, dare I say, a very popular classic Gothic romance. We have a young woman, orphaned at an early age, who, after getting a good education, finds herself the governess of a little girl in the house of a gentleman whom she unwantingly falls in love with. Please be aware that I'm oversimplifying the plot for the sake of time. If I had to summarize the book in 3 words, though why I would want to do that is unclear, I would go with cozy, gloomy, and dramatic. It was also strangely progressive for its time, considering Charlotte Bronte's observations on womanhood, the place of women in society, and the possibility that said women might actually have dreams and aspirations of their own without taking the point to the extreme. I quite liked it. There was a bit of a weird 20-year age gap between the love interests, with the gentleman being nearly 40 and Jane being only 18, but I think, given the circumstances, it can be considered reasonable. Because if the story was written nowadays, I'd have more than a little difficulty imagining that a man of that age and a teenage girl would have that much in common or even be able to understand each other very well. Same goes for women that are nearly 40 and very young men. I'm not gonna sit here yas-queening nonsense, alright? But I think 200 or so years ago, the chance for people with such a large age gap to have similar interests was much bigger, considering that the range of interests was much smaller. From what I can tell, if at the time people shared similar values, they would probably be pretty much okay. Now, there's a lot to be said about life experience and how that changes us, but as a whole, to me, this was acceptable. There was one main thing I didn't like about the book, and that was the quasi-romantic plotline with St. John, is that how you pronounce that? Which was as long as it was unnecessary. I mean, I guess I could see what the author was going for with it, but these endless, repetitive dialogues between Jane and him really overstayed their welcome. Overall, it was a good read, and I got from it way more than I expected, mostly because my expectation was for a purely romantic read, and I am happy I was proven wrong. I gave it 4 stars. Then, and by then I mean a week after that, I finished You Like It Darker by Stephen King. This is a collection of contemporary short stories with a generally unsettling undertone. I can't honestly call any of these stories horror. Some had a supernatural element to them, some didn't, some were very short, some were pretty much novellas, some had very old protagonists, some had very unexpected endings. I think my favorite ones were the first two, Two Talented Bastards and The Fifth Step, and I'm translating these titles from Bulgarian, so I'm not 100% sure those were the original ones. I like the first one because it was told in a very interesting way and it had a very interesting setting, and I really like the second one because it had such an abrupt and unexpectedly sinister ending that it actually made me laugh. I can't say that any of the stories absolutely blew my mind, but I can honestly say that I enjoyed reading all of them. Overall, it was a nice read, and I gave it 4 stars. And the last book I finished in August, well, actually I finished it on the 1st of September, but the final book for August was The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. This is a classic epic fantasy and the 4th book in the Wheel of Time series. Let me be honest, I am on my last nerve with this series, and if you've watched my last reading vlog, you probably know why. Here's what. I don't mind picking up a bad book. I also don't mind picking up a book that isn't necessarily bad, but simply isn't for me. But what pisses me off is when you write a good story and then bury it in nonsense. Because now I am hooked on wanting to know what's gonna happen, but in order to do that, I have to suffer through the insanely tedious, quote-unquote, romantic trepidations of some of the most insufferable people to ever grace the imaginary earth. Tell me why every single romantic conversation is just people yelling at each other. Tell me why, in the middle of every tense, high-stakes scene, there is at least 2 paragraphs mental monologue by one of our heroines about the plunging neckline she wishes to wear around the dude she's supposedly in love with. Which love, by the way, is proven by the verbal abuse she heaps on said dude every time she sees him. In this entire 900+ pages book, there are probably 2 civil conversations, if that. Every single character is the most confrontational loudmouth you've ever imagined. And if it wasn't for the amazing reveals and complex history of this blasted world, I would have DNF'd this whole thing aggressively. But here I am, still thinking of the Eyre and their past and what that means for the future, and I already know that I'm gonna continue torturing myself with this series. And please, don't tell me not to complain then. It is my one joy. I gave the book 3.5 stars. Now, there is one more book that I must mention, if briefly, and that is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which I read in July and then basically reread in August. I won't talk about it because I did so extensively in my July wrap-up, but it was there for most of the month, and I think my mini reading slump might have actually been a book hangover caused by it. Honestly, can't be sure, it's just a feeling. I also won't be adding it to my August stats because I don't want to. And in addition to all I just mentioned, I am also still reading Empire of the Damned by Jay Kristoff, but I'm only doing that on my lunch breaks, so it goes rather slowly. I hope to be able to finish it in September. So, to summarize, in August I finished 4 books, which amounted to a total of 2,315 pages. In terms of genre, I read 1 classic, 1 fantasy, 1 science fiction, and 1 collection of short stories. In terms of formatting, I read 3 paperbacks and 1 hardback, and in terms of sourcing, I owned all 4 of the books. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope you had a good August, both reading-wise and otherwise, and I hope you have an even better September. Also, if you have any thoughts on the books I just mentioned, I would be very happy to discuss them in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to see me do absolutely nothing interesting, check out this playlist. Bye!